Yes, thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight for the launch of the new event series on the growing tide of carbon emissions calculators. This is a series that's launched by PEL8 in collaboration with foraus, the Swiss think tank on foreign policy. My name is Nikki, and I'm the co-head of the Financial Hub program at foraus, and I'll be moderating the event for you tonight. So before we begin, and to give a few more people the chance to join, we're just going to go through some quick housekeeping rules. I think most of you have already seen these before. On the next slide, you'll see just kind of our general rules for tonight's webinar. Some of you might already see the red flashing button at the top left-hand corner. The event's being recorded, which means that everybody who has signed up to the event will also get a copy of the recording once it's done. We'd be grateful if you can ensure that you're muted during the event, just to prevent any disruptions to the speakers and to your fellow participants, of course. And we would encourage you to turn on your video if you'd like to, just so that we can make the event a little bit more human-centered. But of course, it's not a must. As already mentioned before, to everyone who already came in, we're going to be using Slido for sharing our questions. And you can see the link again there with the code. But as mentioned, we'll come back to this again later so that it's a bit more clear and everybody gets the chance to access Slido. So your event hosts for the series starting tonight are PEL8 and foraus. For those of you who don't know foraus, we're an independent and volunteer-driven grassroots think tank on foreign policy matters. Foraus advocates for constructive foreign policy and offers young people the opportunity to get involved with foreign policy discourse outside of the traditional framework of political parties. And tonight we also have the pleasure of having Julian Osborne, the co-founder of PEL8 with us, who's going to briefly introduce you to PEL8 and the origins of this series. So Julian, welcome.
Thank you, Nikki. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Julian Osborne, one of the founders of PEL8. PEL8 helps companies collect and aggregate their sustainability data. So we look at all of the ESG verticals, not only environmental, but in the course of our less than a year of being a startup, we've come across a lot of different kinds of carbon calculation tools, and it was a newish topic for us back when we started, but we've learned a lot. And yeah, kind of one of the initiatives that we wanted to start to bring the ecosystem closer together was this event series, where we kind of share a bit our knowledge, where we can bring together players that we've come across, because as an ambition central player of a sustainability journey of any company, I think that's kind of our role. And so we came up with this 5 minutes, 5 pitches, 5 dimensions concept, and approached foraus, and they were very kind to join us on this first event. And we'll be planning to publish more in this format very soon. And that's all for me. Thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Great, thank you very much, Julian. So tonight, as Julian mentioned, we're fortunate enough to have a really great lineup of speakers that are going to be taking you along 5 dimensions. And so they're each going to be providing us a different view on the topic and their work in relation to carbon emissions. We have Jocelyn Hansen from Searoutes, Philipp von Bieberstein from climatiq, Stephanie Tauber Gomez representing the wiser flagship of Digital Switzerland, Christian Sutter from mympact, and Mark Corbet from Thrust Carbon. Unfortunately, Lea Wollensack from ecoinvent, who was initially a speaker of the series, has had to excuse herself due to illness, but we're incredibly grateful and thankful to Mark for jumping in at this short notice, and really excited to hear what you have to say tonight as well. So just to introduce to everyone who might not be aware of these 5 dimensions that Julian also mentioned before, you'll see these on the screen right now here. And so what we've got, the 5 dimensions are firstly problem solving, technology adoption, sustainability contribution, policy recommendations, and then one thing that the speakers would change if they could. So this is kind of the focus that will be the presentations that you're about to see next from the speakers. In terms of questions, following the presentations, we're going to be moving to a discussion round where speakers will respond to any questions that you have. We've already mentioned a few times at the beginning that we're asking you to submit your questions via Slido. We're trying this out as a new format. So anybody who has any issues with Slido, please do just share your questions in the chat as well, and we'll make sure they find their way into the Slido format. Enter the code here, 509649, if you are able to access Slido. And then without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, which is Jocelyn Hansen from Searoutes. She's the Vice President of Sales at Searoutes. And Jocelyn has worked at technology companies within the container shipping industry for over 20 years and is passionate about providing carbon insights to shippers and freight forwarders so that they can not only provide accurate emissions reporting, but also make data-driven decisions for carbon insetting based on the balance between cost, speed, and the environment. So thank you very much for joining us, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Nikki. Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm more than happy to explain a little bit about Searoutes this evening. So just to sort of go through the 5 pillars that we were given, and to give you a little introduction to Searoutes. So we very much focus on the carbon calculations within the transportation industry. And no matter who you are in the world and what kind of product or service that you are doing, even as a consumer, a lot of people don't really think about the supply chain and actually the transportation of that good that is actually a really big part. 8% of all CO2 emissions around the world come from the transportation of goods. So it's really important that we have to look at this particular area, and this is what Searoutes specializes in, is very much these calculations, thinking about road freight, rail freight, air freight, sea freight, and even in the waterways. We need to really measure these as well to see what the impact is on the goods that we are producing and the goods that we are consuming. To give you a bit of an idea, by 2050, we're expected to multiply our freight by about 4 times over the entire globe. So if you think about what that might occur in terms of CO2 emissions, it's really important that we gain control of what we're doing right today, and knowing what we're actually emitting in terms of transporting the goods around the world, so that we can make sure that we actually, have the opportunity to reduce them. And this is what Searoutes is doing. So we actually take in all modes of transport, but we very much come from the Searoutes. The sea was where we started, hence the name. But we do take in all modes of transport, and we measure the exact and accurate emissions of the transportation of goods. So we're looking at things like the accurate distances, whether that's on the road or in the water. We're looking at the speeds of specific vehicles and specific vessels, etc. We're also looking at other things like fuel consumption and other things that can actually impact the CO2 emissions that are made during the transportation of goods. And this is where we are specializing, so very much in this area. I know I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to keep going. But in terms of technology and things, so Searoutes is actually an API first company. And I'm hoping that everybody knows what APIs are. But I think one of the key things that we've definitely found within the sort of industry of logistics and supply chain, there's quite a number of softwares out there already. A lot of companies have invested a lot of money already in transportation management systems, in supply chain management systems, contract management systems, lots of different systems. And rather than creating yet another system that you have to then get a user to actually adopt and learn yet another way of doing things, we actually focused on gaining the calculations and sending them via API connections into existing technology, so that we actually limited the obstacles that you have when you're trying to get customers to actually adopt these kinds of calculations. If anybody knows anything about the shipping industry, we're very much at the beginning of digitalization. A lot is still done in Excel. A lot of people even use AS400 systems, if anybody knows what that is. There's a lot of data in the industry, but it's very fragmented and it's not very complete and it's not very accurate. So one of the things that Searoutes is doing is looking to aggregate this data to be able to use it for the calculations. So it's something that is, it's a very tough process in terms of technology in the shipping industry. But it's definitely something that we are, trying to help people by using APIs rather than any other way of using it. I mean, when we think about climate and ESG and what searoutes does beyond, you know, the calculations that we do for transportation, I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that searoutes is actually has 70% of our management team is actually female as well. So I'm very supportive of the fact that we're a very diverse team, both geographically as well as in terms of female to male ratio and a lot of other things. And we do a lot to, promote other types of sustainability. And I think our industry, the logistics industry as well, in terms of sustainability, I was really looking at it. I've spent the last 3 days in Rotterdam at something called Smart Freight Week, where we've been looking at specifically into carbon calculations and had all of the major shipping lines, major freight forwarders, major shippers there. And for 3 days, 120 people ate a purely vegetarian meal, every single one of them, because the organizers did it. So I think people are starting to really look at how they can, you know, contribute not just as a consumer, but also as employees, also about, you know, the industry that they're in. And I think that's really cool. When it comes to policy recommendations, this is a little hard one when it comes to the shipping industry, because there are so many players involved. We're not just talking about one country. If you think about the transportation of goods, generally speaking, they're coming from another country to your country. So you have to really think of the world and think about how, you know, standards and things like that can really help to drive things forward. So I would definitely say that my personal and recommendation would be very much towards making sure that there's wide collaboration in the industry in making these calculations. It's not just up to technology players, it's not just up to policymakers, to research institutes, to the people that are actually shipping it, the goods owners, the shipping lines. It's up to making sure that we have a wide variety so that you also look very much into the data of it. I think there is a lot of data out there, and I think it's important to, you know, look at that kind of broad spectrum as you're sort of moving things forward. And I would definitely say if there was one thing that I could change, I think it's just actually from a very personal perspective, I would say it would be great if more people actually started to think about not just about the good that they are buying and how sustainable they are, not just about corporate sustainability in terms of, you know, what are my calculations in the production of my goods, or what are the, sustainability calculations that I need to make on my company or on my person, but think about supply chain as a whole. Where are you buying your goods and what's the impact? To give you a little thought, you may not realize this, but a short distance in Switzerland for a truck may emit more CO2 than a longer distance in the US across a flat terrain because of the elevation. So there are definitely certain things that can impact certain goods. If you're sitting in New York, it's greener to drink French wine or Italian wine than it is to drink Californian wine, just because sea freight is much less in terms of CO2 than either truck or rail. And it's these kinds of considerations that when you're buying goods as a consumer, or as you are thinking about how you should transport your goods around the world, that you need to also pay attention to the transportation. I mean, I know this is the scope 3 and it's the part of everybody's ESG things that is kind of left to the side, and we'll get there eventually. But we need to start thinking about it today. And this is definitely the message that I would say. So I hope that was my 5 minutes. I hope that covered everything, and I'll pass back to you.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. And if you have any questions already off the back of that, then please submit them via Slido, and Jocelyn will be answering them once we get the discussion around. It was really interesting to hear from you about the freight industry, especially what you said at the end. I think a lot of consumers in particular, even if they're trying to practice conscious consumption, what they'd consider is that distance more than anything of a good that is coming to them, rather than, like you said, there's so much more involved in terms of whether you ship that by boat or actually over land over a shorter distance by use a truck. So really interesting also for me. So thank you, Jocelyn. So next we have Philipp von Bieberstein from climatiq, who's joining us. So Philipp is the co-founder and Chief Commercial Officer at climatiq. Climatiq's carbon intelligence assists companies in reaching their net zero goals, and Philipp is motivated by climatiq's conviction that carbon intelligence is a key pillar of a successful net zero strategy. So welcome also, Philipp. We're really grateful to have you, and I give the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Nikki, for having me. Amazing to be here. And I had to chuckle a little bit. We have two companies that approach this issue in a somewhat similar way, right? So we're a bit broader than Searoutes, but we're also an API first company. But with a similar conviction, I think we can have, what we're always setting out to do is we want to build an infrastructure layer that enables any developer to quickly develop a new application on top or integrate our stack with existing applications, so we can have a broader impact faster and quicker development. So what do we do? So we're also into measuring carbon. We're very much a technology company, and so we're measuring carbon emissions. We do this twofold. We have a database of emission factors that we've built. It's, I think, by now one of the most comprehensive data sets out there from emission factors, because we're actually aggregating different sources into one coherent set of data, and then we make that database machine readable. So if you take current data, sometimes it's in PDF, sometimes fat files, sometimes Excel. Everybody has a different structure. Everybody presents the data differently, and we take it and we really normalize the data so it can be used inside software. And then the second thing we do, we make that available in an API, and we build an abstraction layer. What I mean by abstraction layer is we strip away the complexity of the data. So some of that is for people that are not familiar with, I think many people in the audience are familiar with scope 1, 2, and 3 and things like that, but not everybody is. And a lot of people just want to get started. And if you just want to get started, some of it can be a bit daunting. There's so much data out there. There's so much complexity. And we get very simple questions every day about what is a spend-based emission factor and why should I use this and not that. And so this computational layer strips away the complexity and makes these decisions for you so you can just get started. But again, you need to be somewhat technical. You need to have an API. So that's really what we're doing. We're looking not at searoutes. We're looking a lot at procurement at the minute. We're also looking at other forms of transport a little bit. We're also looking at cloud computing. Cloud computing, Jocelyn just said transport makes up 8% of emissions. Cloud computing, like cloud data centers, make up 4%. It's more than air travel. It's incredible. So we're looking a lot at that and how companies can optimize their computing, the emissions that come from computing. Second question, what kind of technological barriers are there for our technology to be adapted at scale? So the API can be used by anyone, and it's really easy. And we have the documentation out there, and we see, every day we have, a lot of people coming up, signing up, trying it out, from students all the way up to like big enterprise companies. But it's currently somewhat, because it's an API, it's restricted to developers. You need to know how to code. At least you have done a coding bootcamp. And what we want to do over the next 6 to 12 months is really build integrations and make this data set and this technology underneath it much more accessible for people that are not familiar with APIs and that don't know how to use a terminal, for example. So that's really our focus. I think the third question, climate, ESG, sustainability contributions, what are our organization's contributions to sustainability beyond climate? And I have to say, right now, we are only focusing on climate. And this may sound a bit weird, but this is, for us, we're focusing on one thing, and we do, one thing really well, which is measurement and low impact climate. And that's what we do. We are also taking ESG very seriously. We actually are now registered B Corp. I don't know if you're familiar with B Corp, but it looks at a lot of different things, or governance and about female representation, actually diverse representation to begin with. So we're taking that very serious as well. But I think unless we're much bigger, I don't know how big the contribution will be. Let's see. But I hope the main contribution for us will be in the climate side. And the last two questions are on policy. And one thing I want to put into together, because I feel you know, we often approach, because we're a technology company, we're looking at this, we're building a new technology set software, and people sometimes come to us and say, what are you doing? You know, how are you solving this problem compared to, I don't know, direct air capture or carbon removals or better energy systems? And that, you know, I think it's a puzzle, right? There's so many people that need to contribute in order for us to tackle this climate crisis. My wish was for our politicians in Europe and the world to make stricter, pass stricter regulation, really tighten the screws and force people to be transparent, force them to use renewable energy and really decarbonize faster. I think ultimately the change will come from politics, not because people do voluntary carbon removals. So if I could change one thing, is tighter regulation now. That's me.
Thank you very much, Philip. That last part really resonates with me as well, of course, regulations. And as we know in Switzerland, we're a little bit more light touch on that front as well. So very interesting to hear you say that as well. Thank you so much for all your input. And I love the fact that it's going to become simpler as well for non-tech people like me as well, and that you're trying to really break down this scene, which is great. So thank you so much. Again, questions to Philip, we'll be having those at the end, so please submit them. And then next, we're going to be moving on to Stephanie Tauber Gomez from the Wiser flagship. Stephanie is a senior program manager for ecosystem innovation and is currently co-leading the Wiser flagship program of Digital Switzerland. Wiser aims to create the world's biggest and open source digital ecosystem made in Switzerland for greenhouse gas emission assessments. And Stephanie sees challenges arising in our volatile and complex world as opportunities to create and further develop more sustainable solutions to shape the process by which we produce and consume. So looking forward to hearing from you, Stephanie. Over to you.
Thanks a lot. I have to say, I think the first challenge is to explain the Wiser in 5 minutes without a single slide. So that's a first. So what is actually the problem that we're trying to solve? So I think actually interesting is currently how environmentally friendly a company is on paper depends much more on the locations and the methods used to assess it. So one big challenge that there is, or problem that there is out there, is the lacking consistency between the differently used emission factors, the databases, and the underlying calculation methods that are being used. So there is an uncertainty of around 50% with the emission factors that we have today. So basically, the carbon footprint of a banana in Germany will be different than in Switzerland than anywhere else. But how can we make all of this comparable? And there's the whole difficulty of the data gathering within the companies, right? Oftentimes this is done still manually with Excel sheets, and it's dependent on experts that are becoming more and more rare to access, right? And at the same time, you have a multitude of new reporting standards that are arising. So for companies, sometimes it's not so clear which reporting standard should they be following. So what we are trying to do is really create an open source ecosystem that helps to streamline the access and the connection to different data sources to create an increased consistency, and to streamline as well the reporting process for companies. How we're doing this is we basically have now 4 years to approve how such a open source ecosystem could work, as we are a project currently being funded by InnoSwiss. And we do this in a consortium with different research partners, such as Paul Scherrer Institute, that has, for example, developed the open source software Brightwave for life cycle assessment, and as well public and private partners such as ABB that wants to help us develop this ecosystem to accelerate their path to net zero here in Switzerland and their manufacturing sites. So the technological barriers, it's actually interesting because I do believe that the technology being used, such as, for example, knowledge graphs is not so complex, so it's fairly easy. Everyone has actually already been using such knowledge graphs. So if ever you do a search query at Google and you see on the right upper side that knowledge box, that's a knowledge graph, basically grabbing the different information that looks most relevant to what you're looking for. The barrier is more the complexity to have such an ecosystem that should be connecting individual data sets and algorithms and analysis so that we can actually make sense out of it. And I do believe that another barrier is really finding the right experts. So, or the limitation that there are just, a limited amount of experts, people having this knowledge, and the whole idea of this computational thinking, because you need to connect so many different areas together. Just like climatiq, we are very much just focusing now on GHG emissions data. Why so? Because we believe that once such an open source ecosystem has been developed for GHG emissions data, it will be much, much easier to then use this architecture and this concept for any other kind of data. And with this, going to the policy recommendation, there's quite clear ideas from our side. So we would expect to make greenhouse gas accounting mandatory for companies. Why? Because we believe that, so similar to the mandatory adoption of the international financial reporting standards, this could help create a more concrete and more accurate information on greenhouse gas emissions for the public to decide according to their climate criteria. So one very clear example, if you as an end consumer would like to what's it called, pay off your flights, right? To depending on which airline you're using, even though it's the very same flight, even though it's the very same airplane, you will end up having to pay another amount. So it does look like something is not right. So the accuracy that everyone has to adopt the same standards will help us as an end consumer to have an increased trust and act upon it. And lastly, my one wish, actually last week I had to think most about this part. And last week I was at another sustainability event with different companies. And what got me very frustrated is everyone just keeps talking about what great things they're doing, as if they've all got it figured out. I think collaboration can only work when companies start admitting and publicly communicate where their shortcomings are, so that we can actually act together upon it. So my wish would be, for an increased leadership and for people to just be more courageous.
Thank you, Stephanie. What a nice note to end it out on, and how true it is really, like, about the whole collaboration, the harmonization that's needed in this space. It's great to see what you guys are doing to try and address this as well with the creation of this new ecosystem. So I'm really looking forward to learning more as the time goes on. And thank you for giving us all a glimpse here at Wise's endeavors here. So yeah, again, questions to Stephanie, use Slido. And then we'll move on next to Christian Sutter from mympact. Christian is the co-founder and CEO of mympact, which is a mobile platform that empowers people across Europe to take control of their environmental footprint by calculating the CO2 emissions of their purchases and helping them to make more conscious decisions generally. One of mympact's fundamental beliefs is that what can be measured can be managed, and that the tracking the footprint of personal actions should be as easy as using a fitness app to track your exercise, which I wholeheartedly agree with. So thank you very much, Christian, and welcome.
Thank you, Nikki. Absolute pleasure being here, and you introduced perfectly. We're taking a little bit of a different angle on the topic. We're addressing carbon emissions on the individual level, and looking forward to answer these 5 questions in the next 5 minutes. Let's start with the problem. If we ask people on the streets right now whether climate change is one of the top 3 issues of our time, 90% of all of the people agree with you, which is a nice thing and a good start. About 70% actively want to do something and reduce their impact. But then when it comes to the actual decision making and what people actually do, less than 40% are really doing something. And this is because, and we all know that climate change is extremely complex. We lack personal intuition about what we can do. We don't really have transparency that we need to take our decisions, and we don't have the tools that help us to really take control over our personal impact. And this creates a lot of frustration. And we are constantly in this situation of, we know that we should do something and it would be the right thing to do, but somehow life gets in the way and it's too complex. And that's where we come in, where the mympact app is helping you. And we are helping people across Europe to understand their CO2 footprint of their purchases. So we automatically calculate carbon emissions each and every time that they spend money on something. So the way you can imagine mympact, it's an app. You connect your payment accounts, you start to understand where in your life the impact is actually happening. And then we are taking this a whole step further by introducing logic that works really well in fitness apps to give you tips, allow you to participate in challenges and give you sustainable alternatives in each and every life area that help you to actively reduce your personal impact. So climate action becomes actionable, and we help people on their journey towards a more sustainable life. And as you said, it's a bit like a fitness tracker for sustainable living. So same kind of problems, and we are helping people to create more incentives. In terms of technological adoption, it's actually integrating, and we have heard that it's integrating 2 different APIs. One is the open banking API, which allows us the connection to all the bank accounts. And then the second one is the API of a carbon accounting model that we integrate. And this works really well. Of course, you have some regional limitations, like for example, Switzerland is not where Europe is in terms of open banking, which is a shame, but we hope that we're going to get there. And then on a more detailed level, of course, when we talk about basket level transactions, we are working with approximations. So we are not giving our users, we're not able to give our users at the moment on an item level basis the data that they need. So for example, if you go to the supermarket and you purchase something, we don't know exactly what you can purchase, and that's obviously something that makes the model less intuitive, and there's ways around. We work with user profiles, so if you're vegetarian, we're integrating that and adjust all food relevant transactions. You also have the chance to have a manual input, but this is one of our key topics where we want to evolve in the future and really focus on to get more item level data into the system and make it even more precise and kind of so you're reaching the 80% accuracy with the standard model, and then we are working on the 20% to make it even more accurate on top. What do we do in terms of sustainability beyond climate? As some of the organizations have said, climate is our main focus because we believe that this is the most important and most timely priority right now, and it's also a really good starting factor. Midterm, we want to become more holistic and include social factors in the rating of consumption and purchases as well, but that's something that we will only start to integrate once we're live. And if we talk SDGs, I think right now we are contributing to quality and education because we are really educating with our application and doing a part there. Affordable and clean energy is a big topic of our app because it's a big leverage that you have. And then of course, number 12, responsible consumption, which is basically what we do by creating this two-sided marketplace and giving people access to sustainable alternatives. Policy recommendations, that's a tough one, and for us I would say probably a little less on top of mind because we are still in the voluntary space, and for individuals it's not mandatory to do something there, but from my perspective I think the key issue is measuring, and I think going beyond the obligation is a first step, but going beyond and a good start, but going beyond that it's much more about establishing consistent and coherent frameworks. So it actually gets comparable between countries and organizations, and you increase the transparency, which will ultimately lead to a better quality as well. And last one, what would I change if I could change something right now? I think in the whole discourse that we have about climate change at the moment, it's the how can I call it? The outsourcing, the mental outsourcing of responsibility. It seems like a big blame game where individuals blame the companies blame governments and politicians, and we're all very good at that, and then kind of identifying which factors should do something. But then we're all causing damage in one way or another. So I think if everyone would just take the responsibility in the areas that they can, be it the individual, the company, or the governments, then we are moving in the right direction. And that's probably the one small thing that I would mention here. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. And yeah, thanks for pointing out that exactly it's kind of time to stop playing pass the parcel in that sense. And also highlighting, as we've kind of seen with all of our speakers going along, how multifaceted this area is and how many different levels are incorporated in us tackling these problems at the E, S, and G level, and how big each of those individual ones are. That exactly a couple of you are focusing on the climate area right now, because that in and of itself is such a huge monster to kind of pursue. So we need to really get engaged here, and everyone's doing a great job here so far, and I hope everyone's learning a lot from all the speakers presenting themselves. So thank you, Christian, again. And next we'll come to our final speaker of the night, which is Mark Corbe from Thrust Carbon. Thank you very much for joining us, Mark. It's a real pleasure to have you tonight, and thank you for jumping in at such short notice. Mark is the founder of Thrust Carbon, an award-winning carbon intelligence platform that delivers emissions reporting, reductions, and removal. And Thrust Carbon is on a mission to make travel effortlessly green. So thank you, Mark, for introducing this to us, and I look forward to hearing the 5 dimensions that you'll speak about tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Gosh, it is a pleasure to meet you all over Zoom. Please do reach out if you've got any questions afterwards, and I'll drop my LinkedIn and so forth in the chat. Brilliant introduction in terms of Thrust Carbon. You know, we really fundamentally believe in a world where our actions shouldn't have to cost the earth, and we're doing everything in our power to answer how we do that with a real focus on travel and that path to effortlessly green. So the challenge that we have across travel is we're awash with data, but coming up with actual effective climate and carbon disclosure reporting, very, very challenging, often expensive, inaccessible. And then you've got to map it out across an entire technology landscape, which can be quite fragmented. So as a business, you know, we've become the leading emissions intelligence tool across the entire travel industry in really just the last 3 years by virtue of sitting independently as that organization working with every kind of actor in the space. So for context, we represent about $52 billion worth of travel spend. You know, our clients and partners include the likes of CWT through to SAP, Concur, Harman International, Novartis, and plenty more. So really what that then means is that we are capturing all of that travel data, turning it into emissions data, and then presenting it as intelligence that allows them to map out the future of their programs, drive kind of reductions across the entire travel ecosystem, you know, again, working with airlines and bringing all of that data and richness into the individual travelers' hands. And then with that better data, we get reductions, and then we can start doing the removal piece. We can start selling things like sustainable aviation fuel, and again, driving investment into that. Context is only about 0.1% of all aviation fuel is SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. That needs to grow. That is still not a net zero fuel by any stretch of the means, but it is a big step forwards. And it is also, for context, one of the most challenging areas to decarbonize. You know, we're not going to have electric flights between London and New York anytime soon. If you're flying across Norway, by contrast, on an 11-seater plane for 45 minutes, then yeah, fantastic. So there are good things happening there as well, outside of what we do. That's kind of questions, I guess 1 and 2. The key barrier, really, just to emphasize that, is the fragmentation of travel. Also standardizations. We find a lot of companies hold back from doing that first step of measurement because they can't verify the data, they don't trust the methodologies, there's too many too many people with too many opinions rather than really clear science. So we're working very hard to streamline that process. Number three, I spend every single moment of my day thinking about climate, and that keeps me pretty busy. So, I mean, I'm very grateful when we do offsetting and things like that for clients. It does have a really positive impact in terms of community developments, and they are a very powerful financing tool in ensuring we're not building more, you know, dirty plants, really. Number four, policy recommendations. You know, for us, we really help people move around the world for the least amount of emissions. And one of the things that is difficult is we sell into travel businesses and we're saying, you know, at some point you're going to have to travel less, because we can't just switch everything to renewables. So, you know, in our opinion, certainly gone are single day trips. Certainly if you're jumping on a plane there, back in there in the day. I was in Basel just a few weeks ago, took the train back in the afternoon, absolutely delightful, had phone calls the entire time. You know, I had a complete, full, productive working day, more so than I would have had going to the airport and flying back, you know, to London. And then lastly, one thing to change, difficult number to track, but we basically spend approximately $5 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we spend that on renewable subsidies. And that's out of my control at this point. So that's us. So yeah, Thus Carbon really driving travel towards being effortlessly green. And I really look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was great. Yeah, I'm really glad that you've also kind of got that courage to step up to companies and say, you know, you're gonna, or people, you have to travel less at the end of the day. That's also going to come into it, despite all of the other efforts that you might be making as well. So good on you there as well. So it's looking forward to seeing what else you're doing. And yeah, in that case, we're now going to be opening up to the questions. So I think we'll have all of our speakers showing back again here. And as you can see on the slide here, one more time, how you can connect to Slido in order to submit your questions, and any issues, do just pop them into the chat and we'll have somebody pop them through Slido for you. We have, of course, gone a little bit over time in our presentations, but in all honesty, I did not want to stop those. So I think you've gotten a lot of good information out of them. And also rest assured, we have had the speakers kindly say that they would also take questions after. So we'll pop those through and answer just to everyone who signed up to this event tonight. We'll send through the responses after, together with the recording. So don't worry if your questions don't get answered now, they will do later. So I think we'll go for the first one there. That's addressed to Christian. What do you think of the proposed, oh no, now it's gone. That was no, not as easy. Sorry, Christian, we're going to have to wait quickly to see if that one pops back or start with another one. Okay, I'm very sorry, Christian. We'll come back to that question for you later. So we'll go from the first one up there, saying getting non-sustainability clients to get interested is a big one. We get a lot of not my job. Any tips here? So this is an open question for all of you speakers. Whoever wants to, please just unmute yourself and give your opinion.
I'm happy to start. I would say that one of the things that we definitely find is just providing the visibility can increase the awareness, whether somebody actually takes a decision to do something differently because of what they see, but especially in the freight industry, if you're at least showing what the options are, what's my shortest route, what's my cheapest route, and what's my greenest route, just by having that visibility in front of you, whether somebody chooses the greenest one or not, that's a different matter. But just having that visibility is a really key thing to getting people more engaged.
Thanks, Jocelyn, that's great. Does anybody else still want to follow up to that? Just maybe actually you can physically raise your hands and then I'll see and go ahead. Great, thanks, Mark. Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of points here. One, you know, I'm a big fan of qualifying out companies when doing sales. You don't need to sell to everyone to go on the sustainability journey now, right? We do eventually, but we don't need everyone now. We need to find the people who are forward thinking, who want to be leaders in the space, who want to reap the benefits that also come with investing positively in environment, our world, our people. So that focus can help. But then in terms of when you do need to kind of get people focused, if it's you're working internally with your team or something like that, if you can find genuine data that paints a very clear picture of why they need to change decision making, perhaps, rather than just it's the nice fluffy good thing to do, right? Like, we need to do everything in our powers to move away from any of that kind of older sentiment and approach.
Yeah, that's so true too. Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, then I'll move on to the second question, unless anybody else wants to jump in. We've got quite a lot to get through here as well. So the next one's for you again, Jocelyn, actually. What position do you have on where the footprint associated with shipping is assigned, i.e. with the manufacturer, supplier, or the buyer, where the demand is?
It's a huge debate, I would say, even in the freight industry, about Scope 3 emissions and where they should be assigned and how do you avoid double counting. It's a massive issue because should it be assigned to the goods owner and the person that's actually producing the goods? Should it be assigned to the logistics service provider that's actually transporting the goods? At the moment, there is a lot of double counting going on in Scope 3 because it's both the suppliers of whether it's a Unilever that's actually producing the goods, or whether it's a Kuehne Nagel that is actually shipping the goods. They're both counting it at the moment. So I would say it's one of the biggest issues of doing Scope 3 emission reporting is trying to avoid the double counting. And I don't think that there's any conclusions, even in the industry, in the freight industry yet, about how that should be avoided. I think at the moment, it's really definitely, so long as somebody's counting it, then we're starting somewhere. As long as we know how much that is, then at least we get a bigger grip on how to actually change things. But it's definitely still a debate. So it's a good question.
Great, thank you very much for answering that, Jocelyn. Then the next one is the thoughts that, well, perhaps any of you, but maybe even I'll direct it at Philip. We'll see if we get it pinged off to somebody else. But what are your thoughts on carbon calculating for service-based industries?
Yeah, I think that's super important. And I think this is so much easier, right? So if you have a long supply chain and, really hard to do, really complicated, really intransparent, service-based industry, comparatively easy, right? You have travel, right? And you can use Mark's solution for that. You have travel, you have maybe some freight, but you have cloud computing, which is what we do well. You have buildings, which is not that complicated, easy. So in my mind, quite straightforward to do. Where you don't have activity data, you can actually substitute this with what's called a spend-based approach, where you look at how much you're spending on a particular service. And it's there's quite a lot of data out there, including like cleaning services, catering, all that stuff. And you can get a pretty good sense of your carbon footprint very quickly with that. So I think it should definitely be done. Easy across all three scopes, actually.
Great, thanks so much, Philip. I saw a couple of nods from some of the other speakers. So if there's anybody else who also wants to add anything, please go ahead and say so. But otherwise, I'll move on to the next question here too. But it's nice to see some nods of agreement there for you, Philip. So thank you for that. Then next, addressing Stephanie, what threshold would you suggest in relation to the possible mandatory greenhouse gas accounting?
Well, that's the great thing when I just have to come up with a suggestion and not going into the details, right? No, to be very honest, my first thought would be, whenever introducing a policy, it has to be realistic for then the companies that have to abide to it, right? So one idea that I came across, and actually you guys from foraus did a policy brief on counting emissions, which is really, really good. So I highly recommend it. I think I'm just going to post it to read it. Where you guys came up as well with the idea of a integrated reporting. So basically already using the financial reporting standards that are out there and just having to integrate the greenhouse gas emissions reporting into it, with the idea as well that maybe one could see the synergies of the hotspots, so the emissions hotspots, right? And where the expenditures are, etc. So I don't have a very definitive answer to this, as I do admit I'm not a policy expert. Yeah.
But thanks, Stephanie. Despite that, you handled that question very well. Very big open question. And yeah, thank you for mentioning the work of foraus there too, which is of course volunteer-based, really member-driven. So it's people like everyone here in this chat as well who were able to produce that policy brief as well that we submitted. So thank you, and we'll make sure that that is posted later on. The next question is for Philip. How did you approach measuring and establishing a cloud computing emission factor? What are your main criteria and/or assumptions?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we have enough time to go through this. We have a cloud computing endpoint in our API, so that facilitates that. The key things to look at is that the big cloud providers mask their true emissions by saying that they offset everything, but you don't know how they do it, what they offset, where the offsets are going. And so you don't actually know what the true emissions are. And so we try to cut through this. And the way we're looking at measuring it is primarily energy consumption that derives from CPU utilization and CPU hours for a given virtual machine and a server. That's quite technical. Networking and storage and memory. So those are the four factors: CPU, networking, storage, and memory, which is data you get from your logs, and then based on that we can auto calculate the emissions for the top three providers. We're currently looking at doing this for on-prem as well. If most of the data centers are on-premise, much harder to do. But yeah, equally similar ideas. The one thing I want to add, by the way, is that we're always talking about emissions. Data centers in particular have a ginormous toll on water. So the data centers are among the top 10 consumption industries of water in the US, for example. And this is something that needs to be reported more as well.
Thanks, Philip, and thank you very much for highlighting that point. Super important. I think it goes unnoticed a lot of the times too. So the next one's for Christian. Nope, sorry. I've kind of gotten confused with these. Oh no, the next one is for, sorry, I'm going to go for the one in between because my screen is freezing up a little bit. For all of Jocelyn, Philip, and Mark, you all talked about regulations, difficulties to regulate. Do you have any thoughts on the Taxo 4 project by the EU and the impact that this will have?
I'll go first, ladies first, I guess. I would say, first of all, I am not familiar with the Taxo 4 project by the EU, so I can't really comment on that. But what I will say is that there's a lot of information and regulation coming out of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. There are certain standards that are available even now. For example, we are accredited by something called the GLEC framework, which is something that's used, the Global Logistics Emissions Council framework. There are different regulations and standards that are being introduced. And there are different projects. One of the key things that I would almost say is that there's almost too many projects going on. It's hard to keep an eye on which ones to follow, at least in the freight industry when it comes to carbon emission reporting. But I'm afraid I don't know about the Taxo 4 project, so I can't comment on that. Maybe the others can.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. I've got a loose working knowledge of it. I mean, it's a lot about definitions. Like, it's a taxonomy project, a guide to what is sustainable behaviors and production processes, etc. So it looks good. By contrast, the things that I'm most interested in are just anything to do with numbers, right? It's anything that can be fundamentally measured and ultimately can have regulations and, dare I say, penalties against them. You know, governments are by and large quite slow to act, but as the climate crisis realistically escalates and gets worse, you know, at some point we're going to see more I'm not going to say panicked decision making, but more drastic, perhaps, decision making. And if it is just a case of, look, we're just going to arbitrarily say every company needs to reduce their emissions by 30% in the next, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it might be, that would be a huge step forwards, because if they don't, there'll be massive financial penalties. Those financial penalties could then be spent on, investing in renewables, carbon capture technologies, all sorts of fun things like that. To what extent this happens and when, I don't know. But for me, it feels inevitable. It really feels inevitable. It's a question of when.
I'm like Jocelyn. I'm not too familiar with the Task Force project. I'm familiar with the EU taxonomy as a whole for sustainable investment and the impactations thereof, but not the recent. I just looked it up, and that's something I need to dive into more. There's a lot of regulation in place, and I think it's a good thing. Hopefully, and there's a lot of standards developing. I think as Marcus hinted at. But yeah, I'm not too familiar with it, so I can't really comment on it.
Great, thank you, all of you. We'll do one last question, I think, for Christian, and then we're going to sadly have to wrap it up. But again, we will share all of the questions again with the speakers so that there's a chance to get responses for everyone who's attended tonight. So Christian, question for you: what can or should be done to push open banking in Switzerland? Perhaps quite a big one to end on, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think two things. One is the more traditional way. Obviously, in terms of regulations, we would expect something to happen. It would have been cool to kind of piggyback on what Europe has been doing with the Payment Directive 2, and take that in Switzerland as well, because Europe has shown quite exemplary that this drives a lot of innovation with third-party providers and third-party services. Is also one of the reasons why we have decided to launch with our product in Germany and then go to the EU. I think the second one next to that is going to be use cases. If it doesn't work in the regulatory way, or if this way takes too long, it's about showing what can be done and how value can be created, not just for the customers, but also for the financial institutions as well. So we are always going to have one eye on Switzerland, and we are looking with SIX that is there in this space, what can be done in Switzerland, and as soon as there are opportunities, we're certainly gonna drive use cases in Switzerland as well, and then hoping that showing the value that open banking can provide will ultimately convince all the parties involved that this should be pushed and should be a thing that should be driven forward. So it's regulations on one hand, and then use cases and showing the value on the other.
Great, thank you so much, Christian, for wrapping us up with that question. To everyone in the audience, if you want to continue posting questions, you can still do so. And like I said, we'll just post them to the speakers after that you get your responses. A huge thank you to all of our speakers tonight. It was absolutely brilliant hearing from you along those 5 dimensions and then responses to the questions. I know it doesn't scrape the surface of what all of you do, but it was a fantastic overview, I hope, for everyone in the audience. And it's been a real pleasure to have you. Just as a quick note as well to everyone who's attending, we are sending out a short survey just because this is our first event in this series. So we'd be really grateful if you'd respond to that. It's just been posted in the chat box by Gwen from Pelt 8, and we'll also send it out again together with the recording of tonight's webinars and responses to the questions. So thank you again to everyone attending, and thank you to all of our speakers. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks all, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.